What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Friday, June 7th edition of the Ship My Money Show. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. And we have a 10-game MLB slate tonight. We also, for those interested, have a 4-game turbo slate. DraftKings does have 10K to first on that slate tonight, as opposed to the typical 5K to first. So that's nice to see. So a couple of decent slates tonight. But we're going to focus on the main slate for this show, going game by game, as always, walking through the day's best pitching, hitting, stacks, all of that. If you have questions throughout the show, throw them in chat. Happy to answer the ones that I see in there, whether it's slate specific or general MLB DFS advice. Happy to talk about whatever. As always, also make sure you hit the thumbs up button, give the video a like, subscribe to the channel. All that stuff helps out quite a bit. And we're going to dive in, starting with the Dodgers taking on the New York Yankees tonight in Yankee Stadium. Good park for hitting. Both of these offenses obviously are very, very good as well. We have Yoshinobu Yamamoto on the mound for the Dodgers. He's been excellent this season. Cody Petit is on the mound for the Yankees at 6,100. No real reason to have interest in him in this park and in this difficult matchup against the Dodgers. Yamamoto does still look decent here, though, despite the tough matchup. There's a good chance that Juan Soto isn't playing today. He left yesterday's game early with forearm soreness. Aaron Boone said that he would have additional imaging work done today. So I assume he's not playing today, which does make this lineup worse. It's obviously still a good lineup, but taking Juan Soto out of it certainly doesn't hurt. Yamamoto has been very good so far in his rookie season. 9,800 on DraftKings, projected for about 17 or 18% ownership. Showed up in about 22% of the lineups I built. 28.5% strikeout percentage this year, 2.75 xFIP. Really, really good pitcher. Again, dangerous matchup and not a cheap price tag, but we don't have a ton of great pitching on this slate, and getting to him still makes some sense, even though the matchup is risky. Offensively, either of these teams are teams you can get to really regardless of the matchup. The Dodgers are going to look better than the Yankees because they do have the more favorable matchup against Petit. He, so far this season, has made 2 starts with the Yankees. He made 7 starts at AAA. In his 2 starts, 23.8% K percentage, 3.96 FIP. He projects for around a 22% K percentage going forward, around a 4.2 to 4.5 FIP. So projects as a good enough pitcher, but this is obviously a very, very good Dodgers offense in Yankee Stadium. Good park for hitting home runs. So they're still looking pretty good. They do look like they're going a little bit over-owned, particularly Ohtani and Betts, but obviously still very good plays. Ohtani showing up as optimal about 13% of the time for me. Betts showing up around 10%. The field's a little bit higher, but goes without saying those two are both very, very good options. Then the rest of the ownership falls off a bit. Freeman, Smith, Hernandez, all still relatively expensive, all still good plays if you can afford them. You get some value towards the bottom of the order with guys like, potentially at least, we don't know what the lineup will be, but potentially with guys like Jason Hayward and Gavin Lux. Obviously nowhere near the same level of hitters as the guys at the top of the order, but they are left-handed bats in Yankee Stadium, and it does help you afford the more expensive bats. For the Yankees, again, Soto's in the projected lineup that I used, but it seems likely he's not going to play today. Aaron Judge at 6,400 is playable pretty much no matter what. It's not a good matchup against Yamamoto, but it's still Aaron Judge. The Yankees, if you're getting there, I think are more of just a negatively correlating with a 20 or so percent owned pitcher, and still just obviously a very, very high ceiling. Justin in chat said, say you have a set amount in your account. Is there a maximum certain percent of account total you would risk per day? Yes, but it's kind of more complicated than that. It depends on what you're playing. I'm also not the right person to ask for bankroll management advice. I am not very good at it, never have been. Biggest leak in my DFS game and always has been. But in general, like, yes, you should be basing how much you play on your bankroll, but it's also based on the edge that you have, or at least think you have, and the type of contest that you're playing also. Moving on to the next game, another good hitters park here. Cubs taking on the Cincinnati Reds. One of the best hitters parks in baseball, so offenses are just naturally going to look good. They have high ceilings here. Nick Lodolo is on the mound for Cincinnati. Justin Steele is going for the Cubs. Lodolo is a good strikeout pitcher. He's been hurt for part of this season, but he is fully back. He threw, I believe, 91 pitches in his most recent start. 90 pitches in his most recent start on June 2nd, which was also against this Cubs team. He, for the season, has struck out 26% of hitters, 3.49 xFIP. Just a good strikeout pitcher overall. 9,600 is a pretty healthy price tag. He's getting 10% ownership, which I think is a little bit low here. Again, this is a scary park, and it's not the best matchup against the Cubs, but it is still a good strikeout pitcher on a slate that doesn't have a ton of good pitching. I think he's going a little bit under-owned in tournaments. Justin Steele on the other side, ownership looks pretty much correct for him. He missed the beginning of the season. He's been working his way back from injury. 22.5% K percentage, 4.04 xFIP. Not quite as sharp so far this year as he was last year, but that's to be expected considering that there was some rust to work off. I expect him to be better going forward than he has been to date. He does have a pretty nice matchup against the Reds. He is left-handed, so he's going to get Elly De La Cruz from the right side. Elly De La Cruz cannot hit from the right side, so that is a benefit for Steele. And 7,200 is a pretty good salary as well. The Reds don't strike out as much against left-handed pitching overall, but being able to turn De La Cruz around is nice, and the price tag here is pretty nice on Steele also. So 10% ownership seems perfectly fine to me. Again, both of these stacks, if you get to them, are going to look okay as well, even though the matchups aren't great. The Cubs are showing up a bit more than the Reds, which is kind of surprising to me, just given that Lodolo is a really good pitcher. Not to take anything away from Steele, but Lodolo is the guy that I think I would be less likely to take hitters against in a vacuum. But you do have a lot of power in this Cubs lineup. Lodolo this season, 130 expected ISO allowed to righties. If you go back to last year, it is a 178 expected ISO allowed. So getting to, a pretty cheap Patrick Wisdom, Seiya Suzuki, Christopher Morel, Nico Horner, all from the right side. Dansby Swanson's still cheap. The pricing here, I think, is why you're seeing the Cubs be a little bit more popular. You look at the Reds pricing and you have $5,800 De La Cruz from his weaker side. Spencer Steer is expensive. Other than that, the team's pretty cheap, but those are two of the guys that you would want to get to the most, and they're more expensive than their counterparts on the Cubs. So either offense, I think, is fine in this park, even though the matchup isn't great. It's just a good park for home runs, good park for scoring runs in general, but the Cubs do look a little bit easier to get to from a stacking standpoint. Guardians are facing the Marlins tonight in Miami. So we go from two home run friendly parks to one where it is very difficult to hit home runs. Ryan Weathers is pitching for the Marlins. Logan Allen is pitching for the Guardians. Neither one is projected for much ownership here. Weathers has been better this year than in previous seasons. And that is something that I think is noteworthy because when Weathers first came up with the Padres, he was very young. He was a highly regarded prospect. He never really put it together at the major league level. The strikeouts underwhelmed. He just ended up not being all that good. But he has made improvements. He's striking out 22% of hitters this year, 3.75 xFIP. Those numbers are pretty solid for a $7,100 price tag. The problem is the matchup against the Guardians. Just a very, very difficult team to strike out. Only an 18% K percentage against left-handed pitching since the start of last year. They do also only have a 92 WRC plus on their active roster. So in this park, at 7,100, given his improvements, I think Weathers is going a little bit under-owned, but it's still not a high probability play. He showed up as optimal around 7.5% of the time. It's not something that I think the field is making a massive mistake on. I do think it's something where in large field tournaments, if he lands in lineups here or there as a contrarian play, it's fine. But the matchup just is really, really difficult to get strikeouts in. On the other side, Logan Allen, basically the same thing, 5% ownership, optimal 5% of the time, $200 less expensive than Weathers on DraftKings. He was solid last year as a rookie. So far this season, strikeout percentage is down a little bit at 19.7%. He has allowed 1.8 home runs per 9. This park does help to mitigate power, which is nice for him. And the Marlins don't have a lot of it. Miami's active roster since the start of last season, middle of the pack with a 21.9% strikeout percentage, only an 86 WRC plus against left-handed pitching. So either of these guys, if they just land in a lineup here or there, I think it's fine, but neither one looks like a priority. Neither offense looks great to get to either. The park, again, just not good for hitting home runs. Neither pitcher is terrible. You can see Miami showing up at the very bottom in stacks. Cleveland, more middle of the pack. If you look at five mans, Cleveland does climb a little bit. Probably mostly because you have Jose Ramirez, who is obviously a very good play individually. David Fry has power, but he's incredibly expensive. Josh Naylor is expensive in the lefty-lefty matchup. Freeman's cheap and probably hitting toward the top of the order. But, overall, I think Ramirez is pretty clearly your best play here. Other than that, I don't really see anything that stands out individually. I really, in general, don't like getting the hitters in this park. So far this season, Weathers has allowed a 162 expected ISO to righties. So, doing a decent job of limiting power there against opposite-handed hitters. The Giants are facing the Rangers tonight in Texas, so we're back to another park where you can hit home runs pretty easily. Logan Webb is on the mound for San Francisco. Michael Lorenzen is pitching for the Rangers. Neither pitcher looks like a priority. Tough matchup for Webb. Negative park shift for him as well, going into Texas as opposed to being in San Francisco. But the salary is reasonable. So he's another pitcher here in the mid-range that I think is going a little bit under-owned as far as he's getting 5% ownership and he's optimal like 10% of the time for me. That's not telling me it's somebody that I'm likely to just jam into lineups. It is telling me it's a reasonable contrarian play. Lorenzen's getting a little bit, or really getting twice as much ownership. I think they're very similar plays. You can see an 8% chance of being optimal for Lorenzen for me, Webb at about 10%. So turning some of your Michael Lorenzen into Logan Webb would make sense, but neither guy here looks like a priority. It is a better matchup for Lorenzen. The Giants have a 22% K percentage, 98 WRC plus against right-handed pitching this year. Texas has the fourth lowest strikeout percentage at 18.5%, 97 WRC plus, but also that number is likely to climb because of the amount of talent that is in the Rangers lineup and just hasn't really performed so far this year. One thing to keep an eye on for the Rangers lineup is the status of Corey Seager. He left last night's game early. If he doesn't play today, this lineup obviously is weaker. It makes Logan Webb look a little bit better. If he is in, Seager at 5,500 is certainly a perfectly fine low owned play at shortstop, given the power upside that he gives you. But neither offense here looks like a priority. They do look like they're going a little bit under owned, though. You can see as far as how often they show up in stacks, they're both, sort of middle of the pack here. But when you compare their optimal percentages to ownership, it's just two really low-owned offenses. San Francisco doesn't have as much talent as Texas, but they do give you a little bit more negative correlation against Michael Lorenzen since he's getting more ownership. Texas has the more difficult matchup, I think, against Logan Webb, but they do have more talent, particularly if Corey Seager is in that lineup. So overall, neither one looks like a priority, but certainly spots you can get to be contrarian. They're not getting quite as much ownership as they probably deserve. Seattle's taking on Kansas City in a park that is good for everything offensively except for hitting home runs. So in general, these offenses are probably just going to be a little bit more appealing on FanDuel than on DraftKings because of the scoring system. DraftKings weights home runs more. It's very tough to hit home runs in this park. FanDuel weights runs and RBI more. It's very, I don't want to say easy, but relatively easy to score runs in this park. Bryce Miller is pitching for Seattle. Daniel Lynch pitching for Kansas City. Miller's getting basically no ownership on DraftKings. You can throw him right into that Logan Webb bucket of mid-range guys that aren't great plays, but also aren't as popular as they should be. It is a tough strikeout matchup for Miller. Kansas City so far this season, striking out only 19.5% of the time against right-handed pitching. This park also downplays strikeouts quite a bit. Like I said, pretty much everything is good offensively here except for home runs. Miller is a solid young pitcher so far this season, striking out 25.7% of hitters, 3.65 xFIP. So from a talent standpoint, he looks pretty good. And that's why I think you see him showing up around 8% of the time in the lineups I built compared to his 2% ownership. It's just based on talent. It's not based on the matchup. Lynch does have a good strikeout matchup against Seattle, but I think he's a little bit more difficult to get to here. Offensively, Seattle showing up a lot, even on DraftKings. Again, I think if you're really digging into your lineups and thinking about them, Seattle does, I think, take a step back on DraftKings just because of how difficult it is to hit home runs in this park. But they are still affordable. They do still have a pretty decent matchup against Lynch. I just think they're going to look better, even better on FanDuel than they do for me on DraftKings. Kansas City showing up a lot further down the list. They have the more difficult matchup against Miller, so that's not really surprising. You also see the relatively high implied run total for Seattle at the top of the screen as well. Going back to last season, a 209 expected ISO allowed to right-handed hitters for Lynch, 195 in a very limited sample so far this season. So he does give up power. You do have a lot of right-handed power on Seattle. Dylan Moore with multi-position eligibility should be a popular play at 4K. Julio Rodriguez hasn't hit for a ton of power this year, but he still has the pedigree, and it's likely that between now and the end of the year, you do see those power numbers turn around. So he's popular, maybe going a little bit over-owned considering how many good outfielders you can get, but still looks pretty good at 5,100. JP Crawford, lefty, still a decent value at shortstop as long as he is leading off. Cal Raleigh gives you power at catcher. Ty France, Mitch Haniger, Mitch Garver, all from the right side with power and cheap as well. So I think you can see why, even in a park where it is difficult to hit home runs, you're going to see these Seattle stacks show up a bit. It's just so easy to put together, like Dylan Moore plus Ty France plus Haniger, plus Garver, throw in one of these other guys, and you have a Seattle stack where if they do come through, you're going to be in really good shape because the rest of your lineup's going to look really good because you're able to afford good pitching, afford good one-offs and mini stacks around the Seattle primary stack. So I think that's why they're grading out so well, despite being in a park where it is difficult to hit home runs. On the other side, Bobby Witt Jr. standing out from Kansas City. No surprise there. The guy steals a ton of bases. He's obviously an exceptionally good hitter as well. So any given slate, he's one of the highest upside plays on the slate, and he has multiple ways to get there as well. He doesn't have to hit 2 home runs. He can walk, steal a couple bases, and still be the best shortstop play. So I think going a little bit under-owned, 7% projected ownership, showed up optimal 9% for me. And again, that factors in his salary as well. The rest of Kansas City doesn't look as good, and you would expect that to be the case. Sal Perez, obviously one of the better hitting catchers, but he is expensive. Vinny Pasquantino, solid option at first base, but he's expensive. It's a position where you can generally find a lot of power, and it's not a good park for hitting home runs. I will mention that Bryce Miller has had significant issues with left-handed power so far in his career. Since debuting last season, he's allowed a 253 expected ISO to righties. He's only struck lefties out 19.7% of the time as well. So far this year, 283 expected ISO allowed to lefties. Pasquantino is your best left-handed power bat on Kansas City if you wanted to go that route. Melendez is cheap at 3,300, not the same level of hitter as Pasquantino, but he is a lot less expensive. So I think that is worth pointing out if you're just trying to grab like a home run here. But again, this park makes it difficult to hit them. The Red Sox are facing the White Sox in Chicago. Relatively low total in this game. You have Garrett Crochet on the mound for the White Sox. So you get the 1 day a week where the team facing the White Sox doesn't have a massive implied run total. Cooper Criswell is going for Boston. Garrett Crochet should be one of the most popular pitchers on this slate. He's $8,900, has a decent strikeout matchup against the Red Sox. Their active roster against left-handed pitching has a 25% K percentage since the start of last season. That's 5th highest in baseball, 103 WRC+. And Garrett Crochet is just a monster. 33.7% K percentage this year. He's only walking 5.5% of hitters. That gives him a 28.3% K minus BB percentage. That is the best on the slate by about 2 points ahead of Chris Sale. Sale actually not on this slate, I don't think, but of all pitchers pitching today, he's the best. He has the best K minus BB percentage, about 1.5, I guess, points ahead of Chris Sale. 2.5 xFIP. He's basically Chris Sale, like more or less. Garrett Crochet is a young Chris Sale, or even this year's Chris Sale. Strikeout percentage is a little bit higher for Crochet. Walk percentage also a little bit higher. xFIP's about the same. Scherer is about the same. Just a really, really, really good pitcher. And he's not priced like that. He's $8,900. Like, this guy is essentially the same salary as Bryce Miller, who is good, but not great. So I pretty much get tons of Garrett Crochet every time he pitches. I expect that will be the case again today. He is projected for more ownership today than he's been getting lately because he's been lined up basically on the same slates as Chris Sale for a while. And when they're on the same slate, everybody plays Sale over Crochet. With Sale not being on this slate, you're going to see people just going to Crochet more. But you can see here, I have Crochet being optimal about 34% of the time, which is where the field is at. So it's very likely that I end up getting around that 34% mark. And if not, I might even get more here because, again, I don't think he's going over-owned, and he projects as a top pitcher for me. So very, very happy to get the Garrett Crochet. On the other side, Cooper Criswell, probably going a little bit under-owned. He has been solid for the most part this season. 22.7% K percentage, 3.47 xFIP. Early on in the season, he was being limited. That hasn't been the case as much recently. 83 pitches in 5 innings last time out against Detroit. 76 pitches to start before that, but he gave up 7 runs against the Orioles, so that's probably a little bit misleading. 79 pitches in 5 1/3 against Tampa 3 starts ago. 100 the start before that is certainly an outlier, but you can expect around 5 innings from Criswell here, probably throwing 80 to 85 pitches. At 7K and 4% owned against the White Sox, that's fine. But again, he just is very unlikely to give you like a slate winning score that you have to have. So that does limit the amount of interest that I have in him overall. Stephen Leibowitz said, it seems on the whole hitting is down this season, and at least anecdotally. It makes me want to pay up more on pitching from a DFS point of view. Home runs are down for sure. Part of that has to do with home runs are always going to be down through the first month or 2 of the season when it's cold, but home runs are down. There are certainly questions around what baseballs MLB has been using so far this year. I don't know for sure if offense as a whole is down. I assume that it is just because home runs are down. I don't necessarily know that it leads to the conclusion that I want to pay up more for pitching though, because I've never dug into that. I think it's interesting to think about, but there's like two conflicting arguments that I can come up with pretty much immediately. One would be that if offense is down, pitchers have bigger advantages, and the best pitchers are going to have the biggest advantages, obviously. And so paying for them is going to make sense. The counterpoint, though, is that even mediocre pitchers are going to have success more often. And it's going to be harder for not good hitters to hit home runs and have big games, especially, if you're talking about it being a result of the baseballs not flying as far. So getting like mediocre pitching that's still going to be good, and then paying for the elite hitters that can still actually hit the ball 450 feet would be preferred. So I don't actually have any data or advice on how to handle that. I think there's kind of two competing arguments that within, with 10 seconds of thought make the same amount of sense to me. But I know for sure home runs, at least so far, are down this year. Offensively in this game, if you're going to the Red Sox, it's purely because they do have talent in their lineup and they negatively correlate with what I assume is going to be the most popular pitcher on the slate. There's nothing about Garrett Crochet that suggests you should be playing the Red Sox. It would purely be a game theory negative correlation play. With it being a 10-game slate, I hope that that's not really a route that I'm going. I don't think that it will be, but you can see here that they're probably coming in a little bit under owned, nothing too crazy. Luis Robert individually at 5,200 from the White Sox makes some sense. Just a very good hitter. He is back from the injured list, reasonably priced. But overall, this does not look like a game where I'm likely to be getting to the offenses too much. Criswell so far this season, 157 expected ISO to righties, 158 to lefties. So nothing that really stands out there. Crochet, 120 to righties, sub 100 to lefties. He's not even one of these strikeout pitchers that gives up a lot of power when you make contact. He just doesn't give up anything. And he struck out 32% of righties this year, 44% of lefties. So you get a big split there as far as his strikeout percentage is a lot higher against lefties, but it's not one of those splits where he's only striking out, 22% of righties. He's striking out everybody. And the ones he doesn't strike out are still not hitting the ball well. Colorado facing St. Louis tonight in St. Louis. So a big park downgrade for the Rockies. They didn't really do a whole lot last night. They did enough to ruin Sonny Gray for 60% of the field and like 90% of my lineups. So wasn't really a fan of that. A lot of that just had to do with Gray not being able to throw strikes, though. Here we get Lance Lynn, $7,400, 29 to 30% projected ownership. I get it. He's a good value. He projects as probably the best mid-range value. This is a spot, though, where if you use Sims tools or anything to approximate Sims or anything that factors in range of outcomes, at least with the data I'm using and the way that I'm viewing this, Lynn's mean projection is very good. And that's why he's going to be popular. He is not that much better from a range of outcome standpoint than a lot of the guys priced around him. And that's where I think using optimal percentage and comparing it to ownership can get you some pretty interesting, contrarian plays. Like you think about other guys in that 7K range we've talked about. Cooper Criswell getting around 5% ownership, if I remember correctly. Logan Allen around 5%. Ryan Weathers around 5%. Logan Webb around 5% for $300 more. And all of those guys had optimal percentages around like 8 to 10%. So Lynn does look better. He's showing up optimal around 13%, but he's like 1.5 times as likely. He's like a 1.5x favorite against any of those guys individually. And he's probably a dog, almost definitely a dog to the field against that group. So in any lineup where you're playing popular bats and you need to save some ownership, you are perfectly fine just turning Lance Lynn into pick one of those pitchers out of a hat, and it doesn't matter. If you have a lineup that is already contrarian and you just need the best projected play, then by all means, go to Lance Lynn. It's a good strikeout spot. He has been a good strikeout pitcher throughout his career. It has not been the case this year, though. Only a 21.2% K percentage, 9.3% walk percentage, 11.9 K minus BB percentage is not very good. It's about the same as Logan Allen, who's at 12%. It is behind Logan Webb. It is behind Ryan Weathers. It is way behind Cooper Criswell. So again, this is a spot where industry projections are very heavily weighting Lance Lynn, what Lance Lynn has done in previous seasons. He's been a well above average strikeout pitcher that also gives up home runs. And that's perfectly fine. You need to do that for projections. But pitchers we have so much data on pitching now that I do think you can make some adjustments using that data, especially, once you get a couple months into the season like we are now. And Lance Lynn hasn't been the same guy. I'm checking right now to see where he is in pitching plus so far this season. 93.3 is his pitching plus score so far in 2024. He was around 100 if you look at a weighted score from 2021 to 2023. So that metric is grading out a combination of how he's locating, how his stuff individually grades out, just different factors that go into pitching. And that's down. The strikeouts are down. Like, we have data suggesting that it's pretty likely Lance Lynn is not the same pitcher this year that he's been in the past. That's not to say he can't mow down Colorado, but I just think this is a spot that stands out if the ownership holds where it is, as I'm not likely to be playing a ton of Lance Lynn. I'm likely to be using these other pitchers in that mid-range if I need to go there. Austin Gomber on the other side, 6,300, gets out of Coors, still doesn't look great. Going to be facing a lot of right-handed bats, most likely for St. Louis. So far this season, 16.3% K percentage to righties. He has given up less power against right-handed hitters, only a 163 expected ISO to them compared to 286 to lefties. That holds if you go back to last year as well, but still probably not somebody that I'm going to really need to get to at 6,300. This isn't a great park for hitting home runs, but the Cardinals are still cheap. They are facing a mediocre pitcher. You can still get very high upside lineups around them, the same way that I was talking about with Seattle. Like, you look at the pricing here, and yeah, Goldschmidt maybe isn't what he's always been. Same for Arenado, but sub 4K price tags there. Mason Wynn probably leading off at 3,200. Just, cheap pricing overall. Burleson, lefty against a left-handed pitcher that isn't good against lefties. I don't mind that at 3,100. You can stack St. Louis and then just have whatever you want around them, which puts you in a situation where if your stack comes through, you have like one of the highest upside lineups possible. Whereas, and I don't want that to sound, I realize it sounds kind of dumb where, like, yeah, if you stack a team and they come through, you're in a good spot. That's true. But if you stack like a team that's 5K across the board and they have a big game, you're still counting on a bunch of pretty mediocre players doing well around them for you to actually win the tournament. Whereas you can have a team like a team that is priced like the Cardinals, they can be like the third or fourth highest scoring team on the slate. And as long as, no team hit like 10 home runs or something, you are live to win tournaments just because you can get the best bats and best pitching around them. So really high upside spot for getting to the Cards. Sean V mentioned the Cards drafted Gomber. Yes, they did. And he's not a terrible road pitcher. He gets a park upgrade here. Sean V said 3 runs or less last 6 road starts. He's not a bad pitcher overall from a run prevention standpoint. He gets the park upgrade. St. Louis here really just has to do with pricing. It's not a good park to hit home runs. It's not a bad matchup. It's not a great matchup. But it's really just the pricing and what you can do around them. Colorado on the other side, going up against Lynn. I do think they're interesting because of how much I dislike Lynn relative to his ownership. I mentioned it with Garrett Crochet, where, maybe the people that are most into negatively correlating get to some Red Sox. Here, at least, like, you have a ton of ownership coming into Lynn. The dude isn't on the same planet as Garrett Crochet in terms of talent. The Rockies obviously suck offensively, but their implied run total isn't far off of Boston. It's relatively high for them in a game outside of Coors Field. They're priced up a bit because of playing in Coors, but I can negatively correlate with a washed 25 to 30% owned Lance Lynn. That's pretty appealing to me, especially when the Rockies themselves are also going to be low owned. Right now, projected ownership to this team just around 1% pretty much across the board. Even if that number ends up being like 3 to 4%, I think they're a little bit under owned even before you factor in the negative correlation with Lynn. So as a contrarian stack, I think Colorado actually does make sense here, even though the park sucks and they suck. Houston facing the Angels in another good hitters park. 5.2 implied run total right now for the Astros, about 4 for the Angels. On the mound for Houston, we have Framber Valdez. For the Angels, we have Griffin Canning. Canning has really struggled this year, especially at the start of the year. Really started out slowly. Overall, a 16.5% K percentage, 4.94 xFIP. Lefties in particular have done a ton of damage against him, even going back to last season. 238 expected ISO so far this year, 184 since the start of last year. So last year, actually, he gave up more power to righties. I was misremembering that. 198 expected ISO to righties since last year, 184 to lefties. This year, he's been better at limiting power to righties, only a 148 expected ISO, 295 expected WOBA, but he has still been getting torched by lefties. You have an Astros team that does not strike out very often. They are full of good hitters. I don't really have much need to get to Canning. Valdez on the other side looks fine here. The Angels lineup is much better against left-handed pitching than right-handed pitching. Since the start of last season, they rank 11th in strikeout percentage, but they have a 119 WRC plus. They have a 185 ISO on their active roster, and this is a good hitter's park as well. Valdez is a good pitcher. His strikeout stuff has come way down this season. He had never really been a great strikeout pitcher in the past, and then last year you saw that strikeout percentage increase, and he became a 10 to 11K pitcher. So he because of the strikeout percentage. Now that strikeout percentage is back down to around 19%. He's still good. He doesn't give up power. 3.43 xFIP, 3.94 FIP, 0.8 home runs allowed per 9 innings. So at this salary, I do think he's playable. This is another guy where, yeah, he's a little bit more expensive than Lynn. Lynn is, $800 less. Valdez is projected for less than half the ownership right now. I have him being optimal at about the same rate, even at the higher price tag. The matchup's not good, but he's still a good pitcher overall. He's a hell of a lot better pitcher overall than Lance Lynn. So another guy that I think you can just use in place of Lynn. Jake DeWitt said Josh is going to play 98% Lynn, so easy fade. That doesn't make me want to play Lynn any less, or that doesn't make me want to get away from Lynn any less. So yeah, I think Valdez at this ownership is fine. 12% optimal percentage for me, 13% ownership. Cool. Happy to get there. The matchup does suck. The park sucks, but good pitcher, good at limiting power, good at limiting, getting ground balls, getting weak contact, all of that. Righties this year, 130 expected ISO against Valdez, sub 100 the lefties. The only problem is that he's not striking guys out anymore, but the salary has adjusted. Like I said, he would have been like $1,000 to $2,000 more in this spot last season, and in general probably would have been like $2,000 more on average. So still like getting him at this salary. Happy to get to the Astros. They do look like they're going a little bit overowned relative to optimal percentages, but it is a good park, and they obviously have a lot of good hitters. What this lineup actually looks like, though, will really impact getting to Houston. Alex Bregman is questionable. He was either scratched yesterday or left the game early. I don't remember which one. Kyle Tucker got hurt the other day as well. He is still not on the injured list, I don't think, but seems pretty likely he's not going to play today. So if you get Bregman and Tucker out of the lineup, it's obviously a weaker lineup from a talent standpoint, but it also becomes a pretty inexpensive lineup. Like, you're already potentially getting a $2,300 Trey Cabbage in there. Jake Myers is $3K. You would get, I don't know who, I guess probably Mauricio Dubon if Bregman is out. So it makes the lineup cheaper in a good park and a pretty good matchup. So it's kind of a trade-off where, like, yeah, you would obviously rather be rostering Bregman and Tucker, but it does make the stack cheaper, and then you can get better one-offs elsewhere. So one way or the other, the Astros are going to look good. Yordan Alvarez is going to look great. I mentioned Canning's struggles with lefties this year. Alvarez has, kind of been slumping a little bit, especially last month, but it's still Yordan Alvarez. He's very fairly priced in this park against Canning. He looks very, very good. The righties here, even though Canning hasn't been giving up as much power to righties, they're still good. They're still fairly priced. It's still a good park. Happy to get to them, ownership aside, but it is worth noting that it looks like the ownership here is just a little bit high. And so maybe one way I tend to approach these spots where I do think it's a good spot is, mini stacks, two mans, maybe just grabbing Yordan Alvarez. Astros score 6 runs, but it's on, a 3-run homer, a 2-run homer from Alvarez and a double, and you didn't need the stack. You just needed Alvarez. Stuff like that works out a pretty good amount of the time. So I like mixing these guys in with lower owned stacks. I think that's a pretty good way to approach it. For the Angels, it's a good park, and you negatively correlate with a 10 to 15% owned Valdez. But like I was saying, he just doesn't give up power. And so that is obviously very concerning. Luis Rengifo is interesting because he is MPE eligible. He gives you stolen base upside. He has some power, but it is still a tough spot. Angels are fine as a low owned stack, but that's about it. There's nothing really about Valdez that makes me want to get to them. It's solely that the Angels do have some power and they're in a good park. Now we're back to another pitcher's park with the Blue Jays facing the A's in Oakland. Chris Bassett pitching for Toronto. Hogan Harris pitching for the A's. I don't really have any interest in Harris here. Toronto is a very difficult team to strike out. They have a lot of good right-handed hitters. Harris himself isn't a great strikeout pitcher. Bassett on the other side facing his former team. 8,300. Not a great strikeout pitcher, but it is a good strikeout spot. So it's kind of similar to Lance Lynn. Bassett striking out 21.9% of hitters so far this year. pretty close to Lynn. 4.06 xFIP, pretty similar to Lynn. 12.8 K minus BB percentage, a little bit better than Lynn, but pretty close. Against a team that strikes out a lot, but does also have a lot of power, though the park also mitigates it. So this is just another situation where Bassett projects as one of your best mid-range pitchers. There's no doubting that. There's no denying that. I agree with it. I'm not saying he doesn't, but there's just a difference here between range of outcomes and mean projections. And Bassett is showing up as optimal around 15% of the time for me. The field's at around 28%. In lineups where, like, let's say I'm stacking the Rockies, sure, give me Chris Bassett. There's no reason not to. But in a lineup where maybe I'm stacking Houston or I'm stacking, I don't know, one of these teams from earlier in the slate that was popular, then give me Framber Valdez at half the ownership. Give me one of those other guys that we mentioned that's like 5% owned, and I'll take my chances against the pitcher in Bassett that is in a good strikeout matchup, but himself isn't a great strikeout pitcher, and just isn't going to beat those other pitchers often enough to warrant the gap in ownership that you're getting. But like if you're playing cash, I don't know if he is one of your cash pitchers, but he's certainly on the short list. So is Lynn, because you're focused more on medium projections there. But in tournaments, I think it's a good spot, or a spot that you can potentially target to get away from if you're going to, especially if you're stacking higher owned teams. Getting to Oakland makes some sense for me here as well, just because of the negative correlation with Bassett, just like it did with Colorado. You do have plenty of power bats, Rooker, Langoliers in particular. Bassett in the past, I'm double checking now, in the past, he has been much better against right-handed hitters. This year, that has been the case as well. So that is another sort of point in his direction, depending on what lineup you get from Oakland. But he does have a 26% K percentage against righties. He's held them to an expected ISO below 100. Lefties are only striking out 16% of the time with a 225 expected ISO. So that will be something to pay attention to as well. The lineup that Oakland runs out there will have a bigger impact on Bassett's strikeout expectation than a lot of pitchers. Their projected lineup right now only has 3 lefties in it. All 3 of them are in the top 6, but only 3 lefties in it. So if you get a lineup where there are 6 righties out there, that does look better for Bassett. It does make him look. It makes the strikeout spot a little bit better since he does strike righties out at an above average rate. But you do still just have power in this lineup. And overall, he's an average, but not great pitcher. For Toronto on the other side, they do look good. Again, probably getting a little bit more ownership than they deserve in a park where it's very tough to hit home runs. But fair pricing across the board. Guerrero at 4,700 with first base and third base eligibility. So he's easy to fit into lineups. Projected for about 12% ownership, showed up optimal around 9% of the time for me. Schneider, Bichette, Jansen, all projected double-digit ownership, all going over-owned, but still just good plays from a projection standpoint. Short list of cash options at their respective positions, and perfectly fine tournament plays as long as you are different elsewhere. Just probably guys at their current ownership that I'm not like jamming in tournaments because I don't really think that it's warranted from a range of outcome standpoint, but they do project well. They are good ways to round out your lineups, whether it's as mini stacks, one-offs, whatever it may be. So Toronto certainly looks like the better stack here. Oakland, if you want to stack against Bassett, I think it's fine. But he does do a better job limiting power to righties, which isn't ideal for guys like Rooker and Langoliers. Jake DeWitt said, any thoughts on Progressive Field being plus home runs to right field? I know today's game is in Miami, but seems interesting that Cleveland is hitting a relatively higher amount of home runs at home. I'm not sure if that's always been the case. They do have the wall in left field that is really high, so it would make sense for it to be better for left-handed home runs. Over the last 3 seasons, it has a 91 home run park factor for lefties. It has a 77 park factor for righties. So it's been better for lefties, but still below average over the last 3 seasons. I don't know about, I can look, but this season it has a 138 home run park factor to lefties. So yeah, I don't know what that's about. Like it could easily be a sample size. It's probably a sample size thing. I don't know if they made adjustments. Maybe they did. But yeah, that's interesting. It's probably just noise, unless they change something that I'm not aware of. Also, he said, can you touch on how strategy and qualifiers and satellites differs from large field flagship marquee tournaments? I can just touch on it now. I don't think it does all that much because, like, obviously it's winner take all. It's really top heavy. But if you're playing large field tournaments correctly, you're probably still accounting for tournaments being really top heavy. I personally don't have a way to like distinguish. I need this lineup to finish in first place versus I need this lineup to finish in the top 3 out of 15,000. I think you're kind of doing the same thing. Um, the biggest change would probably be field size. So then you're just talking about ownership being more concentrated on the chalkiest plays in smaller field stuff, especially if you're playing higher stake stuff. But if you're playing like the you know I don't know the buy-in, but like a 6,000 person field qualifier, I'm playing it pretty much the same way I'm playing a 15,000 person tournament for the most part, just for the reasons I said. Finally, last game on the slate, Arizona taking on San Diego in another pitcher's park. Petco, one of the more difficult places to hit home runs. Michael King is going for the Padres, getting 20% ownership. Showed up optimal around 12% of the time for me. Brandon Pfaadt on the other side, 7,900, only 3% ownership. Showed up as optimal around 9%. Pfaadt has a really, 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 really tough matchup against San Diego. They have the lowest strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year at 16.7%. On top of that, they have a 126 WRC plus against right-handed pitching, which is better than every team except for the Yankees. So it is a really tough spot. If you want to just hope that Pfaadt happens to have a good start here at 3% owned because you need to save ownership, fine. He's not a bad pitcher. He's a highly regarded pitching prospect. So far this season, he has struck out 23.7% of hitters, 19.1% K minus BB percentage is good, 3.59 xFIP, all that stuff's good. If he were facing a different team on this slate, I would probably really like him at this price. But as is, the matchup is what it is. It's really tough. That is factored in here, though, when you talk about a 9% chance of being optimal. So he's just another pitcher in this range that is going under-owned. He's not as good as the pitchers that are getting ownership, but he's not as far behind them as the field seems to think. King is getting about 20% ownership, showed up optimal 11 to 12% of the time for me. So another pitcher in this range that projects well. I think is going a little bit over-owned. You can see here I'm a little bit lower on King than at least SaberSim is, maybe than the industry in general. So far this season, he has been good at getting strikeouts, striking out 25% of hitters. He is walking too many guys with a 10% walk percentage. 15% K minus BB percentage is fine. I think he's a good pitcher. I just am, I guess, a little bit lower, at least than SaberSim. It's not a great matchup against Arizona. They haven't been as good as expected from a production standpoint this year, only a 97 WRC plus against right-handed pitching, but they do rank 17th in K percentage. It's not like Bassett and Lynn where you're getting these really good strikeout matchups. It's a pretty mediocre strikeout matchup, and Arizona is also a team that is likely from this point forward to have a higher WRC plus than they do to date, just based on the talent in their lineup. Corbin Carroll, specifically off to a horrible start this year, would be pretty surprising if that doesn't improve. Neither offense is going to look great because of the park. I do think Arizona is interesting just because King's getting 20% ownership and does give up power, although this park, again, does downplay power pretty significantly. 167 expected ISO to lefties this year for King, 192 to righties. I don't mind getting to Arizona because they're cheap and he does give up power. The Diamondbacks are another team, kind of like Seattle, kind of like St. Louis, where they're not in a good park for hitting home runs. And in this case, they don't have a particularly good matchup either, but they do have talent. Like Corbin Carroll steals bases. Even if he can't hit, he steals bases. And sooner or later, he's going to start hitting again. Ketel Marte can hit. Peterson has power. Walker has power. Gabby Moreno is cheap at a weak position. Suarez has always had power in his career. I don't know, maybe it evaporated, but he's only 3,200. So it's another situation where, like, if these talented guys on Arizona actually do what they're capable of doing, then you just have studs everywhere else in your lineup. So that's why it's kind of appealing, in addition to King being 20% owned. But you can see here, as far as the optimal percentages go, we're talking about another team where they're not super likely to succeed. I don't think the field is like way off the mark or anything. They're just not getting there as much as they probably should. Across a set of 50, 100, 150 lineups, I'd probably like to turn, say, some of those like Houston stacks that everybody's getting to into a little bit more Arizona, a little bit more Colorado, stuff like that. Even though that sounds really painful to say compared to a team like the Astros, just from an ownership standpoint. San Diego on the other side, I think another just low-owned contrarian stack. They have a ton of talent, like I said, 126 WRC plus, not a particularly good matchup, not a good park. So all of that stuff is working against them. FOD has held righties to an expected ISO below 100 this year. Lefties are at 151. If you go back to last season when he debuted, 167 expected ISO to righties. You do get stolen base upside with Fernando Tatis as well. If Machado is in the lineup, obviously it looks a little bit better, but neither of these offenses look like priorities. I do think I actually like the Arizona side a little bit more just because of the negative correlation with King and because of the pricing. So that wraps up the game by game portion. To recap, Garrett Crochet looks like the top pitcher by a very wide margin for me, all things considered. Showed up as optimal 34% of the time. Field is there as well. There's a good chance, I think, that I am pretty much just jamming Crochet tonight and then mixing in whatever other pitchers fit with him. Yamamoto and Lodolo look like solid top-end pitching options as well. Yamamoto has a very, very tough matchup in Yankee Stadium against the Yankees, but given how weak a lot of the other pitching is, still looks like a pretty reasonable play. I think Lodolo is going a little bit under-owned here, but does have a tough matchup and a very bad park to pitch in. Then you get to these mid-range pitchers where the ownership is coming into Bassett, Lynn, and to a lesser extent King. I think those are the guys that project the best. Framber Valdez would be in there as well. I think those guys project the best, but I think the range of outcomes amongst this group of pitchers is a lot closer than the field's giving credit. Like Bassett, Lynn, Valdez, King, all 12 to 15% to be optimal for me. Whereas you have this tier down here below them that is like, 5 to 10%. But the Bassett tier is getting 3 to 4 times the ownership. So this whole range, I think, in tournaments is a range you can use where if you're playing popular teams, don't be afraid to go to some of these lower owned pitchers. If you're playing contrarian teams, then go to the pitchers that project the best, like Bassett and Lynn and Valdez. So I think whole pitching range is very interesting from a tournament standpoint. You can get some contrarian options here that aren't that much worse than the popular options. Favorite stacks, Seattle, just because of the pricing, even though the park isn't great. Decent matchup, good pricing. I like getting to the Dodgers here in Yankee Stadium. Houston is either going to be a really high upside stack in a good spot, or they're going to be a pretty high upside stack that is also cheap, depending on the status of Bregman and Tucker. Toronto, not a good park, but a pretty good spot against Harris. I think they're going a little bit over-owned as well. Contrarian stacks, I like Colorado going up against the popular Lynn because they are relatively inexpensive. You do get negative correlation against an over-owned pitcher. I like Arizona for the same reason against King. So that wraps up this show. Thank you for checking it out. Again, hit the thumbs up button if you haven't already. If you are subscribed to my Dub Club content, hit me up in Discord, talk about the slate there. Otherwise, I'll be back on Monday. Thanks again for checking out the show.